Hi everyone, I'm Bo Liddell of Images by Bolin, and what I'm going to talk about in this and several succeeding videos is blending multiple exposures during post-processing. Exposure blending can be very creative, but along with the initial exposure adjustments made in a raw image editor, most of what I'll show you is nothing more than a bunch of technical steps involved in preparing a good quality baseline image that's ready for another more truly creative technique or processing further along the post-processing pipeline. While masking multiple shots during the film days occurred to produce a final result that wasn't possible to capture in one shot, it really wasn't until digital photography and associated post-processing applications had advanced enough that exposure blending really came into its own. To be true, what you can do today to fully meet your creative vision with a camera is far beyond what we could have imagined 20 years ago. We by no means want to become slaves to this technology, and in terms of landscape photography, we don't always want to shoot a scene with multiple exposures in mind. We definitely want to minimize the time we spend in post-processing our imagery as well. However, if creativity and image quality is important, then we as photographers inevitably must consider using the best that technology has to offer to nurture and expand our creative horizons, lest we get stuck in a rut and become irrelevant. Now, I'm absolutely convinced that Ansel Adams would have embraced all that digital technology and post-processing has to offer photographers. However, there is no question that learning how to blend multiple images does take some time, not the least of which is learning how to do it with the various tools in the software application or applications that you use. And that's all too often a deal breaker for many photographers right out of the gates. Unfortunately, closing the door to post-processing your imagery really amounts to stymieing your creativity. And I hope to convince you through this and other videos that learning how to blend exposures is definitely worth the effort. Now, I must apologize to any of you who don't use Adobe software, as almost everything I'll be demonstrating in my examples was processed in Adobe Camera Raw, Lightroom, and or Photoshop. There are other good post-processing applications such as software by On1, and others, but many of them are integrated with Photoshop, and quite frankly I believe that Photoshop is simply the most powerful image editor that's out there today. Fortunately for you, if you haven't already invested in it, it's now much more affordable than it used to be. Should really be in the budget of most serious photographers, whether you're an amateur or a professional. And there's lots of basic learning resources out there to help you along the way. So just what is digital photo blending and when do we use it? Well, I first want to emphasize that this isn't what folks have come to think of colloquially as photoshopping, where you might be making something up or pasting or doing a major removal with a patch tool or a healing brush tool, which in many circles could be considered a little unethical, at least in the photography world. Now, if you're making posters, if you're into graphic design and that type of stuff, these are typical things that you would be doing. But instead, what we're talking about here with exposure blending, it simply involves compositing actual imagery that you've already taken. Usually taken at the same time or within seconds at the same site, and never more than, say, hours apart. And so you still have a lot of skill involved in setting up and composing the shot, trying to remove distracting elements and that type of thing before the time of capture. And you know, the blending though is needed. It's needed to recreate what was in the original scene, or to create a particular artistic effect that you're going after, because what you need to capture simply couldn't be done in just one shot. So when would we want to consider blending exposures together? Well, one obvious example is when shooting high dynamic range scenes, where you have a very wide disparity between the really bright and the dark tones in the subject, such as in this forest understory. Now the photo on the left contains just about all the tonal information in the scene, except for the very center of the sun and maybe a couple other specular highlights that are bursting through some of the leaves there near where the sun is. And, you know, clipping some of those highlights is okay, since I really want those to be clipped. I want them to be white. Now, it has a lot of tonal information even in the shadows, and I could process just that shot on the left in Lightroom, or process it, say, multiple times within Lightroom, and port the separately processed versions into Photoshop for final processing. And I'd get a fair result in doing so, certainly better than I could have done when I was shooting slide or negative film in the past. So what I'm talking about here in terms of quality is graininess or noisiness, or really the lack thereof, the pixel quality, the image quality. But since there's so much tonal range in the scene, and some of the shadows are in the lower stop or two of the dynamic range, I'd have to open up those shadows considerably, which one could blow out the highlights. But, you know, it would definitely reveal a lot of noise and color banding in the shadows, and even many of the midtones, certainly the dark midtones. And as a result, I probably wouldn't, I'd probably generate a slight color cast that would need correcting in the process. Now, while these artifacts won't be as severe with high dynamic range camera sensors, it will still happen no matter what type of sensor you're using, full frame or crop sensor, the best rated sensor in the world or the poorest one. For me, no matter what I'm using, since I want to reserve the possibility to reproduce any of my photo art in a large print format, such noise artifacts are simply unacceptable. And so I will consider employing other techniques to maximize that quality. But the separately exposed shot on the right, I've purposely exposed to the right of the histogram to open the shadows and eliminate any noise. In other words, exposing for the shadows. But in the process, as you probably can tell, I've blown out many of the highlights, which can't be recovered. With basic digital blending techniques that are available within Photoshop, I don't have to choose which shot to use. I'm not always going to be choosing to shoot multiple shots, but in this case, it worked best for me, and I can use both and get a superior result, such as this final product. And I'll be demonstrating at least some of the initial processing of this particular image in one of my videos. Another example where blending is beneficial is when you're focus stacking a scene to achieve superior tack sharp imagery throughout a wide depth of field that's simply not possible with just one shot, or at least not possible due to the effects of diffraction when using the smallest apertures. Now this shows 12 highlighted images in my Lightroom catalog that I took at ground level at Mount Rainier National Park. The closest flower blossoms are only a few inches from the lens element of a super wide angle zoom taken at 22mm focal length. To get the entire shot in focus without suffering any softness required shooting at f-stops no smaller than f/11. To get the entire scene tack sharp and in focus required taking many exposures focused at different distances. Now, due to the bright sky and the alpenglow of the volcano, I had to take one shot exposing for the sky, one for the river valley, and 10 shots exposing the fore and midground at different focus distances. There are some great focus stacking tools, including the Stack Auto Blend feature in Photoshop, as well as programs like Helicon Focus and Zarine Stacker. But the problem is that you can't use automated focus stacking algorithms to stack the shot if the exposure changes a lot, since the routines don't know how to interpret the pixels. This is why those techniques call for a consistent exposure across all the shots. And if you've done focus stacking, you know what I'm talking about. The result here is less than an ideal blend on the right. The shot on the left is the one that was optimized for the sky, and the image on the right is the result of the focus stack of all 12 images. And as you can see, there isn't very good contrast throughout at least 3/4 of this image on the right, including much of the foreground, particularly the midground and the river valley. The sky and the volcano, of course, didn't blend very well together at all. If I redo the stack here on the right, by excluding the sky shot on the left, I get a much better focus stack. You can see from the shadow area in the river valley all the way down to the foreground here, I got an excellent focus stack. Good exposure. I haven't dullened this image at all. Okay. If I toggle back and forth, you can see the difference in the two stacks. By excluding the sky shot, I get a better stack. But the problem, of course, is that the second stack not able to blend in the sky at all. And I want that sky in there. I need to have it. So this is a good example where using standard blending techniques is really the only way to create this shot. And here's the final result. My final vision for this shot, and it most accurately represents the quite amazing scene that I experienced when I was out there. And I achieved this result using standard manual blending techniques. I just couldn't get this shot with the image quality and sharpness I wanted for a large format print, and with the tremendous depth and low close angle that I wanted to portray, without both focus stacking and blending the images manually. Another example that's tailor-made for manual blending is where you may have taken only one shot, but you need to process it multiple times. Say once for the foreground and once for the background. Or you might have to process it several additional times to achieve the final results you're after. The previous shot of the forest understory is an example where I could have processed the dark image multiple times, as I need to do with this Milky Way shot. And this is very common with Milky Way landscape and other star photography landscapes. This is the original image after a couple of basic exposure adjustments using the Camera Raw engine within Lightroom. Now, I wanted to increase, what I want to do with this starting point is to increase the contrast between the lights and the darks that are here in the Milky Way, and especially increase the dark contrast within these dark stardust lanes. And I also want to boost the exposure of the foreground here, which is really dark, but there's actually a lot of tonal information in there. So I want to reveal more of the texture and the tonal detail there. And in case a client purchased this in a print larger than 8 by 10, I wanted to reduce the noise that I knew would show up once I open up the dark tones in the foreground, since the shot was taken at a very high ISO. Here you can see the result. So I'll toggle back and forth a few times so that you can see the noticeable changes in the sky and the foreground. If I had only processed the image once, I would have darkened the foreground more, blown out the whites of the Milky Way, possibly on the mountain as well, and I might have lost a lot of the detail in the sky when trying to apply noise reduction. The only way to achieve all my goals in one image was to process this shot multiple independent times. Here you can see that I had to selectively blend 5 copies of the image to make the adjustments I needed to get what I was after out of the sky, the Milky Way, and the land. Star photography is indeed perhaps one of the best examples where you'll never be able to get the most out of an image without engaging in at least some digital blending and additional post-processing. Yet another example where you can benefit from manually blending your photos is where you need to use different settings to achieve different goals in the same scene. This is really prescient for those of you who are taking landscape shots of waterfalls. So during this particular day at this site, there was almost 30-mile-an-hour winds blowing the vegetation, and I needed to capture about 7 vertical shots that were later stitched together to form a panorama. I had to use relatively fast shutter speeds since I didn't want to blur the vegetation. But for those of you who are really into taking pictures of waterfalls, this is kind of what we're after. We want to create what I call the long, silky, smooth flowing white hair effect in the water, as shown in this photo, which is comprised of a second set of 7 shots that formed a second panorama. But to get this second panorama required really long exposures, which is often difficult to do. To get the exposure time I needed to achieve this flowing effect required using a 5-stop neutral density filter, which enabled shutters of about 5 seconds. The problem is that the vegetation, as you can probably see in various portions of the image, is not tack sharp. It was blurred. And the neutral density filter that I use, and this is a notorious problem for even the best of neutral density filters, it introduced a very slight color cast. If I toggle back and forth here, you can see that there's a difference in the color rendition here that I couldn't completely get rid of in Lightroom. So by using some of the same basic blending techniques that I used in other previous examples, I was able to combine those two multi-shot panoramas, and capture the scene exactly like I envisioned, and without the color cast introduced by the filter. You might also have a circumstance like this where you have a distracting element or two, or perhaps many, that you want to remove, such as the people at the base of this lighthouse. In some circumstances, you could clone or heel brush out the elements, but at other times, you might not be able to do it realistically without spending a lot of time. I was using 25-second long exposures for this in the next shot, and it was already 15 minutes after sundown, and I was losing light really fast. If I had increased exposure to blur out the people on the breakwater, I would have likely blown out the highlights and certainly would have introduced noise from the excessively long exposures, and even more so if I had increased the ISO further. But one handy trick in these situations, and it goes for any landmark where there might be a lot of people moving around, is to take multiple shots, and over time you'll have enough images to blend together as if there was nobody in the scene. If a lot of shots are involved, you might be able to use what's known as the median stacks mode in Photoshop, and it'll automate the process for you. But in this case, with so few folks around, I only needed this second image, and going through the process to use the median stack command would have really been overkill. So a simple manual blend will do quite nicely. And voila, here's the final blend. Took me all of about 3 minutes to do in Photoshop, including the additional post-processing adjustments that were made that didn't involve the initial blend. And I have a final image for output and for reproduction. Now, just as you might want to manually blend out some minor distracting elements, you might also want to mask in some elements or parts of a landscape. Now, at this particular time and setting, I had been patiently waiting for sundown and wanted to capture the waves crashing against the shoreline and capturing the last rays of sunlight, while also capturing the ducks flying in the background as they passed the rocky point when they were trading back and forth between a couple bays along the shoreline. Try as I might, and after many hundreds of shots, I couldn't get the waves right where I wanted them at the shoreline when the birds passed over that point. Luck just wasn't with me that day. This was as close as I could get, but I didn't like the positioning of the waves in this shot. But just a few minutes earlier, I was able to get the wave action and lighting that I was after. Since I was operating on a tripod and had some knowledge of digital blending, it was obvious that basic blending techniques would rescue this shot. So here I was simply masking in different images of the same scene, taken at roughly the same time. So, as with this shot, whenever you can't get what you're after in one shot, ask yourself that question. That should tell you, or that answer should tell you whether or not blending will be needed at some point to realize your vision. Now, a final example before we finish up here with some other points where manually blending photos is beneficial is when you're trying to create panoramas that are challenging, if not outright impossible, to composite or otherwise stitch together automatically in Photoshop or some other panorama stitching application such as PT-GUI. The need to manually blend the shots could happen because of poor execution of techniques, such as failing to account for parallax and using poor holding techniques between the overlapping shots. It can also happen when you've done absolutely everything right, such as in this example, where I was using an ultra-wide angle 14mm lens. This shot In this shot, the field of view I was trying to capture was simply too vast, even for this lens. So I had to capture it in multiple shots. The distortion, though, is so great, and the effects of magnification of different parts of the field of view are so great that even when sufficiently overlapping the shots using a tripod and accounting for parallax, I simply cannot auto-align these using any software. So I also couldn't use the clone stamp feature to try and merge the images together because, again, of the significant distortion. So this shot requires manually reorienting one or more images and then using standard blending techniques again to composite the image. Fortunately, because I knew it was possible to achieve my vision by using basic Photoshop skills that I'd already learned, I was not deterred from trying to capture this scene. Here's the result of using the standard techniques that I'll be demonstrating, that I was able to manually blend together this panorama. And I'm feel very fortunate to have learned these techniques so that I can capture a shot like this and meet the vision that I have for it. So it's taken me quite some time to learn most of the blending techniques that are available within Photoshop, and I've probably not learned them all. Indeed, I've found that there are usually multiple ways to do the same thing in Photoshop. However, as with any technology, you find out what works best and you throw out the rest. The problem is that what works best for one image or circumstance may not work best in another, or may have to be used with other techniques to work. I believe I've stumbled across the most relevant blending techniques that a photographer needs to know about on a daily basis, and I hope that this and succeeding videos in this series will help you sort through the chaff, so to speak, so it can expedite your experimentation with the techniques that have the best chance to challenge and extend your own photographic creativity. Unfortunately, some of the techniques or little-known commands in Photoshop, such as the Apply Image command or Blend If sliders, as well as some of the most powerful blending techniques, including luminosity masking, are not covered very well in what I call the Photoshop Bibles. Those texts are still very important, and they should be a key reference on your bookshelf. And they're going to help you master the basics of Photoshop. But they usually don't have very extensive sections on exposure blending that thoroughly cover the issue in a systematic or logical way, let alone cover multiple scenarios that you're going to come across. If you've not done a lot of post-processing and you want to emphasize, I want to emphasize that you should not be afraid of Photoshop and the learning curve associated with it and the time that's going to be required. It's really not that hard to master the basic stuff that you need to know. And if a middle-aged photographer such as myself who grew up shooting film in the 70s can learn how to use Photoshop and various blending techniques, then so can you. After you've mastered some of the basic Photoshop skills that every photographer should be familiar with and that I'm going to briefly mention in a few minutes, then the blending approaches I demonstrate in my video tutorials should easily be understood and adopted in your daily post-processing workflow. Now, there are a couple really key items I want to briefly emphasize before I continue a little bit more. It's really worthwhile to commit to post-processing your imagery as well as shooting in your camera's RAW file format, unless you must capture your shots in JPEG. So, for example, let's say you're a newspaper or sports photographer and have some good reason for never post-processing your images, or artistic post-processing simply isn't necessary, in which case you're probably not going to be viewing this video anyway. But, regardless, if for whatever reason you can't capture RAW files, you can still use and benefit from standard blending techniques if shooting in JPEG. But just realize that you simply won't have as much latitude to make image adjustments as if you're shooting RAW files, and you'll really have to nail down proper exposure and color balance at the time of capture, and also might have to overall take more exposures than you would otherwise if shooting in the RAW file format. Obviously, if you've been reluctant to jump into software and post-processing your images, I recommend you reconsider. There are so darn many good reasons for this that I don't have time to cover it, but I have done so in one of my videos on maximizing your digital photo quality, which you can find by visiting the video link on my YouTube channel. That video covers some technical aspects of digital light capture, digital exposure techniques to maximize image quality, and addresses why capturing in your camera's RAW file format is so superior to shooting in JPEG. However, grab a cup of coffee or a snack before you view it because it is a long one. But to summarize, if your photographic goals require you to take the quality of your imagery seriously, you should really consider shooting in RAW, period. Also, to fully achieve certain creative goals, you'll need to blend multiple exposures, and you won't get nearly as good results if those exposures were taken in JPEG and are subjected to a lot of pixel editing, as this is particularly important if you plan on reproducing the output in a large format. For the sake of time, there are some things I won't be covering in the upcoming video tutorials, or at least won't cover with detailed steps. The first few I'll mention are technically photo blending techniques themselves, but are easier or easy, relatively speaking, to master. They're well covered elsewhere, and they're mainly automated processes. The rest I'll mention are basic Photoshop skills that you need to come to the table with some general understanding of. And that pretty much goes for any major post-processing you do in Photoshop, whether or not you're blending multiple photos. I'll be using these basic skills in my tutorials, but I just won't be spending much time describing the skills and the steps for utilizing them in detail. The first item I won't expound upon too much, and which really isn't unique to Photoshop, is high dynamic range or HDR processing using dedicated tone mapping commands or software. In my opinion, you can blend a set of HDR images using manual blending techniques with Photoshop with superior results, and I'll hint at that a bit more in a second. But true HDR processing involves specialized 32-bit software or a command routine within Photoshop that deploys 32-bit algorithms and is covered quite well by other people. Perhaps the biggest reason, though, why I won't demonstrate 32-bit tone mapping is that I rarely use it because I find it often degrades image quality and generates unnatural halo artifacts that simply aren't realistic. Now, if that's what you're after creatively, then fine, but I prefer not to create that illustrative or surrealistic HDR effect. Instead, I'm more interested in trying to recreate what I saw at the scene, and I find that tone mapping software, even when using the natural or realistic settings contained within them, can't do that as effectively as using manual blending techniques. Furthermore, you just simply lose some key control when using automated HDR processing, and it simply doesn't work well if there's any subject movement, which is a key issue. I also won't be covering automated focus stacking or stitching panoramas together using automated processes. Again, these aren't just unique to Photoshop, although Photoshop does this type of work very well. If your focus stacking and your panorama technique during the time of capture is done correctly and with little to no movement in the subject matter, there's nothing to the initial post-processing steps other than select the commands and proceed to generate the final output. Once it's generated, that's where the creative part of post-processing will then begin and may well involve further manual blending additional shots to balance the exposure or using one of the original exposures to blend in detail if there was some errors or ghosting that occurred during the stacking process and perhaps due to subject movement. And I did show you an example of the former earlier with the sunrise shot of Mount Rainier. There are plenty of good resources for learning how to focus stack and make composite panoramas. And if I get enough positive feedback, I might do separate video tutorials on these topics, but otherwise won't delve into them very much here. Now, you'll get the most out of my videos if you already understand the various Photoshop basics that I'm going to talk about next. If you haven't yet mastered those basics, you'll still get something out of my tutorials, but it'd be best to revisit them after you've already gotten up to speed with what I call the Photoshop Essentials. These are relatively easy to learn, covered well in almost all major Photoshop reference manuals and textbooks, and they are crucial skills to have when blending images in Photoshop. These skills and techniques include knowing what layers are and how to manage them, such as creating, deleting, grouping, applying blend modes, layer styles, changing the opacity. It would include basic image adjustment layers, knowing what those are, such as curves and saturation and vibrance, color balance, and so forth. Knowing the basics of layer masking. What are layer masks? How to create them, and how to use selection tools, which are a very integral part of creating some layer masks. And really crucial is knowing what the brush tool is and how to use it to apply image adjustments, and to apply masks, as well as create masks. I use a Wacom tablet and pen for most of my brushing, but the brush tool can be used just as effectively with a mouse as well. And the last thing I'm not going to provide detailed steps on is how to create luminosity selections and masks. That's not because I won't be applying them or demonstrating some ways in which they can be used in my examples, but the steps from scratch are fairly involved, and I have opted to either create custom actions or use actions created by others to streamline the steps, and thus it makes it a bit difficult to present the basic steps of luminosity selections and masking without doing several video tutorials on the subject. But fortunately, there are some exceedingly good tutorials available on luminosity techniques that I quite simply can't improve upon. These techniques are rarely discussed in Photoshop manuals and textbooks, and when they are mentioned, there is almost no detail included that's required to learn how to create and use them effectively, especially under a variety of circumstances. But this technique is arguably the most powerful Photoshop blending and image editing approach available, and I highly encourage you to invest in some of the tutorials that are out there. I'm convinced that doing so will change your photography and expand your creativity immensely. It did for me. If interested, you can visit Tony Kuiper's website at goodlight.us for basic web-based written tutorials on how to create and use luminosity masks. And the best part is, it won't cost you a thing other than some time. And you can go there as well and visit the links on his website to purchase and download his Photoshop luminosity actions, as well as the very excellent video tutorials on the subject that were written by Sean Bagshaw. Investing in those will expedite your learning and understanding of luminosity masks, and the actions Tony has created really will speed up your workflow. Now, there are other photographers who've created video tutorials and basic actions for using luminosity masks and selections, but from what I can tell, Tony is the one who pioneered the technique, and Sean's videos are simply the best I've ever come across for learning it and integrating Tony's actions into a processing workflow. So here's a list of the things that I plan on covering in this video tutorial series. It includes layer blend modes, using those in combination with layers, as well as the basics of simple layer masking. Those are critical, particularly that second item on that first line, in learning how to blend your photos. I'm also going to be covering using the layer style blend if sliders and the apply image command. Relatively little known unless you're into graphic arts and graphics design, but they do have their place, and I will be showing at least a couple examples of how those can be used to assist with either blending an image or creating some masks. And then probably the last two priority bullets there are the most important ones I'll be covering, and that is using selections in combination with layer masks. And there's a number of different ways in which you can create selections and assist with either altering or creating layer masks. And then luminosity selections can be used to do what's known as luminosity painting, which in and of itself isn't a blending technique as much as it is dodging or burning, where you're selectively lightening and darkening parts of an image. But I include them under digital blending because in the process of doing your blends, particularly if using simple masks, you may end up creating some artifacts, particularly some darkened edges that need to be corrected. And so the blending isn't really done until you've created a baseline image that is ready for the final digital editing process for final processing in preparation for output. And that process just isn't going to be done until you're done correcting some of the potential artifacts that are created when blending the images. So I'm going to be covering that on at least a couple examples. And luminosity painting is particularly useful when you're using some of the more expedited, simple layer masking techniques. And while spending time selecting portions of an image and applying those to a mask may give you a very good result that doesn't require luminosity painting, in the end it oftentimes takes more time to create sufficient selections versus using a brush to create a simple mask and then using luminosity painting to correct a couple minor errors. Usually goes much faster. At any rate, I hope you've enjoyed the videos this far, and perhaps I piqued your interest, and I hope you'll check out the next part of this video tutorial series. Thanks. Cheers.